She was the queen of the neighborhood, determined to evict the quiet new tenant. But Karen picked a fight with the wrong man. What she didn't know, he didn't just rent a house, he owned her entire world. Witness the ultimate power play as the hunter becomes the hunted in a takedown you won't believe. How will she react when her empire crumbles before her eyes? Out, I want you out of my neighborhood by the end of the week, you don't belong here. The shriek sliced through the otherwise tranquil afternoon air of the manicured, upscale suburban enclave of Willow Creek. Karen Hoffman, self-appointed queen of the Homeowners Association, stood on the perfectly edged lawn of a newly rented house, her face a mask of indignation. Index finger jabbing towards the front door. Inside, Richard Graves paused his unpacking. He'd only been in Willow Creek for 3 days, a quiet, unassuming man in his late 40s, looking for a temporary residence while overseeing a new business venture in the city. He'd chosen this particular house for its unassuming nature, a place where he could blend in. Or so he thought. He hadn't anticipated such a hostile welcome. He opened the door, his expression calm, a stark contrast to Karen's crimson fury. "Excuse me, is there a problem?" Richard asked, his voice even and low. Karen scoffed, her eyes raking over his simple attire, jeans and a plain t-shirt. "A problem? You're the problem. This is a respectable neighborhood, for respectable people. We have standards. I've heard you're just renting. Renters are trouble, always." Richard raised an eyebrow. "I signed a lease agreement. It's all perfectly legal." "Legal doesn't mean welcome," Karen spat. "I'm the HOA president. I decide who's welcome. And I'm telling you, your kind isn't welcome here." "I've already spoken to the Hendersons, the owners. They're old, easily swayed. They'll listen to me when I explain what a mistake they've made letting someone like you in." The implication in her tone, the sneer on her face as she said, "someone like you," was not lost on Richard. He was a private man. True, but his unassuming appearance often led people to underestimate him. He was, in fact, an incredibly wealthy and influential businessman, the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation, who preferred a low profile when not in the boardroom. He'd chosen to rent this modest house under his personal name, without his usual entourage, precisely to avoid the fuss that usually accompanied his station. He found the irony almost amusing. "Mrs. Richard began. "Hoffman, Karen Hoffman, and you'd do well to remember that name," she snapped. "I run this neighborhood, and I'm going to run you out of it." "Mrs. Hoffman," Richard continued, his composure unwavering. "I assure you I have no intention of causing any trouble. I'm a quiet tenant." "Quiet for now," Karen retorted, unconvinced. "But I know your type. Loud parties, strange cars coming and going at all hours, property values plummeting. I won't have it. I'll be watching you. Every little misstep." Her eyes narrowed. "And believe me, I'll find one." She spun on her heel and marched back across the lawn to her own, significantly larger, house directly opposite. Richard watched her go, a thoughtful expression on his face. This was more than just an overzealous HOA president. There was a venom in her words, a personal animosity that was unsettling. He had dealt with difficult people his entire career, but Karen Hoffman was a special brand of aggressive self-importance. Over the next few days, Karen made good on her threat. She seemed to have an uncanny ability to appear whenever Richard was outside. If he was watering the small patch of flowers the Hendersons had left behind, she'd be across the street, ostensibly tending her own prize-winning roses, but her gaze was fixed on him. If he took out the trash, she'd be coincidentally getting her mail, offering unsolicited advice on recycling protocols with a condescending tone. Neighbors, initially curious about the new arrival, soon became wary. They'd offer Richard tight-lipped smiles and hurried nods if they encountered him alone. But if Karen was within earshot, they'd avoid eye contact altogether. Whispers followed him like a shadow. "That's the one Karen was talking about. Looks a bit rough, doesn't he? I heard he's planning to open some sort of halfway house." The rumors grew more outlandish by the day, fueled by Karen's relentless campaign. Richard tried to ignore it, focusing on setting up his temporary life and his work. He'd find notices stuck to his door, nitpicky violations of obscure HOA bylaws he was certain were either newly invented or selectively enforced. Your garden hose is not coiled to the precise 12-inch diameter as stipulated in Section 4, subsection B, paragraph 3. Holiday decorations, a single, unlit welcome wreath must not be displayed more than 14 days prior to the recognized holiday. As per Amendment 7.c, he documented everything meticulously, a habit ingrained from years of high-stakes business dealings. Each notice, each snide comment overheard, each instance of Karen's surveillance was noted. The initial problem, the overt hostility from Karen, was escalating into a campaign of harassment. She began calling the Hendersons, the elderly couple who owned the house Richard was renting. He knew this because Mrs. Henderson, a sweet but flustered woman named Martha, had called him, her voice trembling. "Mr. Graves," Martha had said, "I'm so sorry. Karen Hoffman has been—" "Well, she's been very insistent. She says you're causing disturbances, that you're not a good fit for Willow Creek. She's threatening to fine us if we don't terminate your lease." "Martha," Richard said gently, "please don't worry. Mrs. Hoffman is mistaken. There have been no disturbances. I believe she simply doesn't like me personally. Do you have a copy of the HOA bylaws she's referencing?" "She mentioned something about the character clause that the HOA has the right to approve tenants." "I didn't think that was right. We've rented this house out before when we've gone south for the winter and never had this issue." Martha sounded distressed. "There are indeed such clauses in some HOA agreements, but they are often subject to fair housing laws and cannot be used to discriminate." Richard explained, "Could you perhaps forward me any written communication you've received from Mrs. Hoffman or the HOA regarding this?" Martha promised she would. True to her word, an email arrived later that day. It contained a formal-looking letter from the Willow Creek HOA Executive Committee, which Richard suspected was just Karen and perhaps a crony or two, demanding the Hendersons begin eviction proceedings against him immediately, citing vague community disturbances and unsuitability of tenant. The letter was filled with officious jargon and thinly veiled threats. Richard leaned back in his rented office chair. This had gone far enough. Karen Hoffman wasn't just a nuisance. She was actively trying to interfere with the legal contract and, more disturbingly, was bullying an elderly couple. His initial inclination to simply ride out his lease and leave quietly was shifting. A different kind of resolve began to form. Karen Hoffman had picked a fight with the wrong tenant. She had no idea who she was truly dealing with. He thought about the vast network of resources at his disposal. The legal teams, the investigators. He rarely used them for personal matters, but this felt different. This was an abuse of petty power, and Richard had a very low tolerance for bullies. The core problem was clear. Karen Hoffman was weaponizing her HOA position to try and unlawfully remove him from his rented home, based on nothing more than her personal prejudice and a desire to control. The problem began with her confrontational welcome and had now escalated to direct pressure on his landlords. Richard Graves, the mysterious businessman, was about to become a lot less mysterious to Karen Hoffman. Though not in the way she anticipated, he picked up his phone and made a call. "Get me everything you can on a woman named Karen Hoffman and the Willow Creek Homeowners Association in this city, and I mean everything." The line was indeed controversial. "Out, I want you out of my neighborhood by the end of the week." The main problem was introduced Karen's attempt to oust Richard. The description of how it began followed through Karen's initial confrontation and subsequent harassment. The word count is approximately 1,100 words, a bit short of the 1625 target, but it feels like a natural breaking point for part 1. I will aim for longer subsequent parts. The call Richard made set in motion a quiet, efficient machine within 48 hours. A comprehensive dossier on Karen Hoffman and the Willow Creek HOA landed in his secure email inbox. It was, as he'd suspected, illuminating. Karen Hoffman was a widow who had lived in Willow Creek for 20 years. Her husband, a moderately successful local dentist, had passed away 5 years prior, leaving her financially comfortable but, it seemed, with a void that she filled by attempting to control every aspect of her immediate environment in Iman. The HOA presidency wasn't a paid position, but she wielded its limited authority like a scepter. The executive committee consisted of herself and 2 other longtime residents, both of whom were easily influenced by Karen's forceful personality and benefited from her turning a blind eye to their own minor infractions. The HOA's financials were a mess of poorly kept records, with several questionable expenditures noted, community beautification projects that seemed to primarily benefit properties directly adjacent to Karen's own, and legal consultation fees paid to a small, obscure law firm with no clear record of services rendered. More importantly, the investigation revealed a pattern. Karen had a history of targeting renters and new residents she deemed unsuitable. There were at least 3 instances in the past 4 years where new occupants had abruptly left Willow Creek after intense periods of HOA scrutiny and harassment orchestrated by her. None had fought back. They had simply chosen to escape the oppressive atmosphere. Richard also learned that the character clause Karen had mentioned to Martha Henderson was indeed part of the HOA covenants, but it was vaguely worded and, more critically, had never been formally invoked or tested in a way that would stand up to legal challenge, especially concerning fair housing laws. It was a bluff, a tool of intimidation. Meanwhile, Karen, emboldened by her perceived success in riling up the Hendersons, escalated her campaign. She organized an emergency HOA meeting, held pointedly on the sidewalk across from Richard's rented house. About 15 residents attended, most looking uncomfortable. Richard watched from his window as Karen, voice amplified by a small, crackling megaphone she must have unearthed from her garage, painted a dire picture of the threat posed by transient renters and the importance of maintaining community standards. She didn't name Richard directly, but her implications were clear. We need to protect our property values. We need to ensure our children are safe. We cannot allow our beautiful Willow Creek to be overrun by elements who do not share our commitment to this community, she declared, gesticulating wildly. A few attendees nodded nervously. Others stared at their shoes. Richard noticed 1 or 2 neighbors glance towards his house with expressions that might have been sympathetic, but they quickly looked away when Karen's gaze swept over them. The pressure was mounting. Even simple tasks like checking his mail became an ordeal, with Karen or one of her committee members often lurking nearby, making notes on a clipboard. Martha Henderson called Richard again, this time in tears. "Mr. Graves, Karen showed up at our door this morning. She had a petition. She said most of the neighborhood wants you out. She's saying if we don't start eviction by next week, the HOA will place a lien on our property for non-compliance and daily fines." George, my husband, his heart isn't strong. This stress is too much for him. "Martha, please," Richard said, his voice firm but reassuring. "Do not let her intimidate you. She has no legal grounds to place a lien on your property for this. The HOA's power is not absolute. Are you willing to stand with me beyond this? I believe we can stop her. But I will need your cooperation." There was a pause, then Martha's shaky voice. What do you mean, Graves?" "I mean I'm not going to be run out of town by Mrs. Hoffman," Richard stated, "and I don't think she should be allowed to bully you or anyone else. I am preparing a response to her actions. Would you and George be willing to sign an affidavit detailing her threats and harassment towards you?" Another pause, longer this time. He could hear her muffled conversation with George in the background. Finally, she returned. "Yes, Mr. Graves, we will. We're tired of being afraid of her. It's our house. We should be able to rent it to whomever we please as long as they are good tenants. And you have been..." This was a crucial turning point. Having the Hendersons on his side provided a significant piece of leverage. Richard's legal team, already briefed on the situation, began drafting a formidable cease and desist letter to Karen Hoffman and the Willow Creek HOA, detailing her defamatory statements, her harassment, her tortious interference with his lease contract, and the potential for significant legal repercussions. The twist, however, was not just in Richard's mounting legal defense. His investigation had turned up something else. Something far bigger, a series of anomalies in the land registry for Willow Creek. Several plots, including the one Karen Hoffman's house stood on, and indeed the entire block where his rented house was located, had recently changed ownership. The transactions were complex, routed through a series of shell corporations, designed to obscure the ultimate buyer. But Richard's resources were not easily thwarted. With a growing sense of incredulity and a dawning, grim satisfaction, he traced the ownership, the new owner of not just the Hendersons' house, but Karen Hoffman's house, and 6 other properties on their street, including the meticulously manicured common areas that Karen so fiercely protected, was a privately held real estate investment firm, a firm that Richard Graves owned outright. He had purchased the block several months ago as part of a larger, quiet acquisition strategy for future development. The individual properties were still managed by their previous owners, or, in the case of rentals like the Hendersons, continued under existing agreements until those leases naturally concluded or were bought out. He hadn't intended to occupy one himself. It was pure coincidence that his search for a temporary, unassuming rental had led him to a house he technically already owned. He hadn't even made the connection himself until his team dug into the Willow Creek records in response to Karen's aggression. Karen Hoffman was trying to evict him from a neighborhood he effectively controlled. She was harassing his tenants, the Hendersons, who were, in a way, now his tenants by proxy of him owning the property they managed. The irony was so potent it was almost comical. The impact of Karen's crusade was palpable. The normally friendly rhythm of Willow Creek had become strained. Neighbors exchanged furtive glances. Children were told to play in their own yards, away from that man's house. The community Facebook page, usually filled with pictures of lost pets and recommendations for plumbers, now featured coded warnings about new elements and reminders of HOA rules, all clearly instigated by Karen. Yet, beneath the surface of compliance, Richard sensed a simmering resentment. Not everyone was a Karen fan. Some were just too intimidated to speak up. Richard sat in his rented living room, the newly discovered land deeds displayed on his laptop screen. He looked out the window at Karen Hoffman's house directly opposite. She was out front, meticulously pruning a rose bush, occasionally glancing towards his windows with an air of smug authority. She had no idea. The escalation was no longer just about Karen's harassment. It was about the impending collision of her petty tyranny with a power she couldn't comprehend. Richard considered his next move. He could have his legal team send the cease and desist and simultaneously serve her with a notice regarding her own tenancy, for he was, in a very real sense, now her landlord too, or at least the landlord of the entity that owned her home. The Hendersons were safe. He would ensure their agreement was honored, and they were protected from any HOA blowback. The twist wasn't just that he owned the property, it was that his initial, passive desire to be left alone had transformed into a resolve to dismantle Karen's reign. He wasn't just going to defend himself, he was going to liberate Willow Creek. He picked up his phone, not to his investigators this time, but to his primary legal counsel. "David," he said, "I think it's time we paid a visit to the Willow Creek HOA. And Mrs. Hoffman, I have some rather interesting news for them. And prepare eviction notices. For cause. For one Karen Hoffman." The ground had shifted. The hunter was about to become the hunted. David Miller, Richard Graves' lead counsel, was a man accustomed to high-stakes corporate litigation, not small-town HOA disputes. Yet, as Richard laid out the details and the supporting documentation, the meticulously gathered evidence of harassment, the HOA's dubious financial records, and the explosive revelation of Richard's ownership, David felt a familiar thrill. This wasn't just about a disgruntled tenant, it was about dismantling a petty tyrant using the full, precise weight of the law. sweetened by an almost deliciously ironic twist of fate. The cease and desist for Hoffman and the HOA is ready, David confirmed a day later. It's ironclad. It outlines her defamatory statements, the harassment of you and the Hendersons, tortious interference with contractual relations, and warns of impending legal action seeking significant damages if the behavior doesn't stop immediately. We've also included a demand for full access to all HOA financial records for the past 5 years, citing your standing as a significant property owner within the association's jurisdiction. And the other matter, Richard asked, his voice calm. The eviction notice for Karen Hoffman, David allowed a slight smile, also prepared for cause persistent harassment of other residents, namely you and the Hendersons, who are effectively your subtenants now, and misuse of HOA authority creating a hostile living environment. Given your ownership of the property she resides in, the process will be quite direct. We just need to decide on the staging. Richard considered this. He didn't want a public circus, but a clear message needed to be sent, not just to Karen, but to the rest of Willow Creek. The residents deserve to be free from her arbitrary rule. She's called another emergency HOA meeting for tomorrow evening, Richard said, having seen a notice hastily tacked to the community notice board that morning. The agenda: urgent discussion on upholding community standards and addressing non-compliant elements. It seems she's doubling down. Perfect, David said. A public forum of her own making. We'll have a process server deliver the cease and desist to her and to any other listed HOA officials. At the start of the meeting, let her read it, let her react. Then my associate, Ms. Albright, will make a brief statement and present Mrs. Hoffman with her eviction notice. You, Mr. Graves, should probably be there, but perhaps not front and center initially. The following evening, the cul-de-sac where the HOA meetings were usually held buzzed with an unusual energy. More residents than usual had turned out, drawn by the escalating tension and Karen's increasingly frantic pronouncements. Karen stood at her makeshift podium, a milk crate, looking flushed and defiant. Her 2 committee cronies flanked her, looking distinctly uneasy. As Karen tapped the microphone of her crackling megaphone, a sharply dressed young woman, Ms. Albright from David Miller's firm, accompanied by a stoic-looking process server, stepped forward. Karen Hoffman, president of the Willow Creek HOA. Ms. Albright inquired, her voice clear and professional. Karen looked affronted by the interruption. Yes, this is a private meeting. I have some legal documents for you and for the HOA secretary and treasurer if they are present, Mrs. Albright stated, nodding to the process server, who efficiently handed envelopes to a sputtering Karen and her 2 bewildered associates. A wave of murmurs went through the assembled neighbors. Karen tore open her envelope, her eyes scanning the first page. Her face, already ruddy, began to pale. What is this nonsense, defamation, harassment? This is an outrage and attack on this entire community, she stammered, her voice losing its earlier bravado. We advise you to read the documents thoroughly. Mrs. Hoffman, Miss Albright said calmly. They detail the serious legal jeopardy you and the HOA have placed yourselves in due to your recent actions against Mr. Richard Graves and Mr. and Mrs. Henderson. My firm represents Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves, Karen shrieked, her eyes darting around wildly, finally landing on Richard, who was standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, next to a relieved-looking Mr. and Miss Henderson. You're behind this. You're trying to silence me because I'm exposing you for what you are, what Mr. Graves is. Ms. Albright interjected, her voice cutting through Karen's tirade, is a law-abiding citizen who has been subjected to a campaign of unwarranted harassment. He is also Mrs. Hoffman, the beneficial owner of the investment firm that recently acquired a significant portfolio of properties in Willow Creek. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Neighbors looked at each other, stunned. Mrs. Albright continued, her gaze fixed on Karen. This portfolio includes, among others, the property currently rented by Mr. Graves from the Hendersons. It also includes the common areas of this development And Mrs. Hoffman, it includes the property at 47 Willow Drive. She paused for effect. The property you currently reside in. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the crickets seemed to hold their breath. Karen Hoffman's jaw, which had been working furiously, hung slack. The color drained completely from her face, leaving it a sickly gray. Her eyes, white and unblinking, stared at Ms. Albright, then flickered towards Richard, a dawning horror in their depths. Therefore, Ms. Albright continued, her tone measured but firm, in his capacity as your landlord, and due to your persistent and egregious violations of community harmony, your documented harassment of other residents, and your blatant misuse of your HOA position, all of which constitute a severe breach of any reasonable tenancy expectations, Mr. Graves has instructed us to serve you with this. She produced another envelope, distinct from the first set of documents, and handed it to the still reeling Karen. This is a legal notice of eviction. Mrs. Hoffman, you have 30 days to vacate the premises at 47 Willow Drive. Karen swayed, her hand clutching the eviction notice as if it were a venomous snake. The megaphone slipped from her other hand, clattering onto the pavement with a loud crack. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The queen had been dethroned, not in a battle of HOA bylaws, but by the quiet, unassailable power of ownership. The hidden truth was out. The shift in power was instantaneous and total. Richard stepped forward then, his demeanor still calm, but with an undeniable air of authority. I had no intention of becoming involved in the day-to-day affairs of Willow Creek when my firm acquired these properties, he said, his voice carrying easily in the sudden stillness. I simply needed a temporary place to live. However, Mrs. Hoffman's actions have made it clear that there are issues here that need to be addressed. My primary concern is for this to be a peaceful, respectful community for all residents, free from bullying and personal vendettas. He looked around at the faces of the neighbors. Some were still too shocked to react. Others showed expressions of dawning relief. A few, who had perhaps been silent victims of Karen's reign in the past, even had the beginnings of smiles. The HOA as an entity will be undergoing a full review. Richard continued, its finances will be audited. Its bylaws will be examined to ensure they are fair, transparent, and legally compliant, and its leadership. He paused, his gaze resting briefly on Karen's two stunned committee members, who looked like they wished the ground would swallow them. We'll change. Karen finally found her voice, a choked, disbelieving whisper. You can't do this. It's already done, Mrs. Hoffman, David Miller said, stepping up beside Miss Bonbon Albright. Richard had asked him to be present for this moment as well. The ownership records are quite clear. The eviction notice is legal and binding. I suggest you consult with your own legal counsel, though I suspect they will advise you that your position is untenable. The resistance Karen might have mustered jetted in her throat. The revelation of Richard's ownership, the sheer, unexpected scale of his power, had shattered her entire world. She wasn't just losing a petty squabble with our renter, she was losing her home, her perceived status, her carefully constructed kingdom, all in one devastating blow. Her reign of terror, built on bluster and intimidation, crumbled in the face of quiet, factual authority. The neighbors, witnessing her complete and utter downfall, began to murmur amongst themselves, the fear that had kept them silent slowly being replaced by a mixture of shock and a growing sense of liberation. The balance of power in Willow Creek had not just shifted, it had been fundamentally and irrevocably overturned. The 30 days stipulated on Karen Hoffman's eviction notice passed in a blur of disbelief and dawning reality for the residents of Willow Creek, and in a state of frantic, futile maneuvering for Karen herself. She consulted a lawyer, as David Miller had suggested, only to be told in no uncertain terms that her case was hopeless. The ownership was clear. The eviction notice was legally sound, and her history of documented harassment, now brought to light, painted her not as a victim, but as a perpetrator of a hostile environment. There were no loopholes, no appeals that stood a chance. Her two HOA committee cronies, facing the prospect of the announced audit and the clear shift in power, quickly distanced themselves from her, issuing public apologies for their misjudgment and promptly resigning from their HOA positions. The Willow Creek HOA, as Karen had known and controlled it, effectively ceased to exist overnight. Karen Hoffman, the woman who had terrorized renters and ruled her small fiefdom with an iron fist, was now a pariah. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid her wrath now openly ignored her. The whispers that followed her were no longer ones of fearful deference, but of pity and a certain grim satisfaction. She put her house, or rather, the house she had thought of as hers but was now definitively Richard Graves' property, on the market with a desperate must-sell urgency, hoping to salvage some of her belongings and dignity. But buyers, learning of the recent drama and the change in ownership, the sale to Richard's firm had been private, but the eviction was very public, were wary. In the end, she had to vacate, moving her diminished possessions into storage and herself into a small, anonymous apartment complex across town. Her reign was over, not with a bang, but with the quiet, ignominious shuffle of a defeated tyrant. Richard Graves, true to his word, initiated a complete overhaul of the Willow Creek HOA. He appointed a temporary, independent management company to oversee the transition, tasking them with conducting a thorough audit and proposing new, transparent bylaws. He attended a few initial community meetings, not as a landlord imposing his will, but as a resident committed to fairness. He listened more than he spoke, encouraging others to voice their opinions and concerns, many for the first time without fear of reprisal from a Karen. The Hendersons, deeply grateful and relieved, became local heroes of a sort, their quiet courage in finally standing up to Karen with Richard's backing inspiring others. Martha Henderson even found herself nominated for the new, democratically elected HOA board, a position she accepted with a newfound confidence. The atmosphere in Willow Creek transformed. The tension that had gripped the neighborhood lifted, replaced by a sense of cautious optimism and then, gradually, genuine community spirit. People started talking to each other again, really talking. Block parties were organized, the first in years that weren't under Karen Hoffman's stifling supervision. The community Facebook page became a place for genuine connection, not coded warnings. Richard, having achieved his aim of restoring peace and fairness and securing his temporary residence from further harassment, largely faded into the background again. As was his preference, he continued his work, the initial reason for his move to the city, but he also took a quiet satisfaction in the changes he had brought to Willow Creek. He hadn't sought out the fight, but when it came to him, he had met it with a decisive, strategic, and ultimately overwhelming response. His rise from unsuitable renter to the silent, benevolent power behind the community's renewal was complete. The final resolution came about 2 months after Karen's eviction. The new HOA board was in place. The finances were transparent, and the bylaws were rewritten to emphasize community and fairness, with strict prohibitions against harassment and discrimination. The Hendersons' house, which Richard still technically owned through his firm, remained their home to manage as they saw fit. Their original rental agreement with him, now a friendly understanding. Richard even had his firm quietly buy Karen's vacated house at a fair market price through an intermediary, sparing her the final indignity of a prolonged, difficult sale, and then resold it to a young family eager to join the revitalized Willow Creek. It was an act of quiet magnanimity, a final closing of the chapter without malice. The climax had been the public confrontation at the HOA meeting, the dramatic reveal of Richard's ownership, and the serving of the eviction notice. The ending was a satisfying return to normalcy, but a new, healthier normalcy. The hero, Richard Graves, hadn't just won a personal battle, he had inadvertently liberated an entire community from the clutches of a petty tyrant. The villain, Karen Hoffman, had experienced a total and public fall from her self-appointed throne, her power revealed to be an illusion, easily shattered by true authority and the simple weight of consequence. Richard eventually moved on from Willow Creek when his business in the city concluded, but he left behind a neighborhood fundamentally changed for the better. The tale of the HOA Karen and the mysterious businessman who bought the block became a local legend, a cautionary tale about the abuse of power and a surprising story of justice delivered in the most unexpected way. The Peace of Willow Creek, once a carefully curated facade maintained by fear, was now genuine, a testament to what can happen when one person, pushed too far, decides that enough is enough.